Some people would think that the interesting question about the deal with Iran, let's start with Iran, is it a good deal and should we take it? So Ken is here to talk in part about his new book, Unthinkable, which you should all buy and get signed later. He wrote this because nobody read his last book on Iran, The Persian Puzzle, so he felt he should say it again. And because he realized that his book before that had a typo and it said Iraq instead of Iran, so he had to really sort of correct it. He also, of course, is the co-author, as I'm sure you all know, of a brilliant article in the new issue of Foreign Affairs, which you should also subscribe to, called Near Eastern Promises, which basically is a tour d'horizon of what the Obama administration should be doing across the Middle East at this point. So let's start, Ken. By the way, I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, no, 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 this is what you should do. And so I always...
With absolutely no expectation that he will do anything that we discussed.
Let me start by saying, some people would think that the interesting question about the deal with Iran, let's start with Iran, is it a good deal and should we take it? You think that the right question to ask is actually, what would happen if you didn't get a deal? Why is that the right question, and how does that feed back into the question of how you evaluate the deal and whether we'll take it?
Okay, that's close to what we talked about. I can work with that. First, let me say again, it's always wonderful to be back at the Y, and Gideon, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. You were my first choice. I'm delighted you were willing to do it. It is always such an honor.
I was the only one who would say yes.
You were the first one. But I think the question you're asking really is a critical one, because I think that the conversation that we're having about Iran now, I think is a good conversation. I think there are a lot of interesting points that are being made in the media, in the public discourse. I think that it is actually having an impact on the policymaking community. When we got the temporary deal with Iran back in November, I spent a lot of time with different congressmen. It was really striking how much they've been picking up on the debate that's going on. I think that that's a wonderful thing to see. But that said, as you've pointed out, Gideon, I think that there is another debate out there that we're not having, and that's really critical to have, and it's really the topic of the book, which is this question of if we don't get the deal, and by the way, the book does talk about the deal and what the deal should look like and why it would be good and what we need from it and all that kind of stuff, but it also talks about what happens if we don't get the deal. And that's critical because we may not get the deal. Right now, the last few weeks down in Washington, I've been spending a lot of time talking with our government about the deal, and I'm really struck by how optimistic they are about it. And you hear from the policymaking community a sense that the deal is more than a 50-50 prospect. From the intel community, from my old friends at CIA, they have a more pessimistic view. But if you kind of average the two of them out and you decide that, well, maybe that leaves us with a 50-50 prospect of getting a deal with Iran, that's still remarkable. I've been working on Iran for over 26 years, and if at any point in time you told me that we were going to have a 50-50 likelihood of getting a nuclear deal with Iran, I would have been stunned. So even that is saying something. But that still means that there's a 50% chance that we won't get a deal. And if we don't get a deal, we need to know what we're going to do then. And what's more, it's critical to understand and to have thought through what it is that we would do if we didn't get a deal to know whether or not we should take this one. Because the fact of the matter is, as you well understand, Gideon, we're not going to get a perfect deal. It's just not in the cards. The Iranians are not going to say, you know what, this was all a big mistake. We've realized the error of our ways. We're going to give up our program and do exactly what you ask us to do. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to make concessions to the Iranians. We're going to get part of what we want, but not everything. No matter how much Prime Minister Netanyahu may desire us to get everything, it's not realistic to assume it. And so the question is, given that we're going to get an imperfect deal, how do we decide whether or not we want that deal? And you have to have asked yourself the question of, what would I do if I don't take this deal? What are the choices then, and what's my preference? And the problem there, again, as you know well, Gideon, is that at this point in time, we're really only left with two choices if we don't get the deal with Iran. We can go to war with the Iranians to turn off their nuclear program for good. Shut it down, do away with that problem. Or we can revert back to a containment policy, which is the policy that we've employed against Iran very successfully for the last 34 years, but recognizing that it may not stop the Iranians from acquiring nuclear weapons. And if that's the case, we will be containing a nuclear Iran. And the technical term for that kind of a situation is that it will suck. Right? And so this is the problem that we face. But if we don't get this deal, we're going to have to make that choice. And it's important for this deal, for understanding whether or not we should take what will inevitably be an imperfect deal, because how you think about whether we should take that imperfect deal is going to be conditioned by what you decide about what the alternative is. I mean, just think about it this way. If you're willing to go to war with Iran, in the event we don't get a deal with them, if you're willing to pay all of the costs and run all of the risks associated with going to war with Iran, recognizing that it may not be limited to just airstrikes, which is what its proponents hope, but I think unfortunately is unlikely it will be contained to, if that's the case, then why on earth accept anything but a perfect deal with the Iranians? Under those circumstances, if you're willing to pay those costs and run those risks, you should be willing to go full bore and say, I want a perfect deal. If not, by God, I'm going to go to war. And on the other hand, if you're willing to contain Iran, if you're willing to contain even a nuclear Iran, then pretty much anything that's better than the status quo is worth doing. Because the status quo right now is the Iranians could get a nuclear weapon if they wanted to. They've had that capability since 2008, and if we don't get a deal with them, there is every risk that they will go ahead and acquire a nuclear weapon, and we will wind up paying those costs and risks. And so under those circumstances, anything we get from them, anything that pushes off the date when they get that nuclear weapon, anything that makes it less likely that they will get it, is better than what we've got right now. And so that conditions how you think about this deal and what you're willing to accept.
So what is a sort of legitimate, if imperfect, deal that is plausibly acceptable in your view?
From my perspective, and some of you may have seen, I have a piece in the New York Times where I kind of talked about this. I think that what we need to focus on are three critical issues in a deal. We have to focus on inspections, we have to focus on sanctions, we have to focus on duration, how long it lasts. And I come at that simply from, in the course of writing this book, having looked at the history of these kinds of arms control agreements, whether it be with third world countries like Libya or North Korea, or with other superpowers like the Soviets. And the question really that I set out to answer when I went looking at those historical cases is, when do they work, when do they not work? And they seem to work best when you've got an effective inspections regime that makes the target country believe that it's likely that if they cheat, they'll get caught, that there is a very powerful disincentive for them getting caught. And in the case of Iran, that's got to be sanctions. And the big issue out there is, as we've seen with countries like Iraq and other countries, it's very hard to get the Security Council to approve new sanctions. So the real danger would be that if we lift all of the sanctions on Iran, if we catch them cheating, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to get the Security Council to impose new sanctions. It's why I've proposed that we have a snapback mechanism in which sanctions are suspended rather than lifted, which simply means that every 6 months they'd come up, the suspension would come up for renewal. As long as the Iranians weren't violating the agreement, they would automatically get renewed. But the moment that we decided that they were cheating, all we would have to do is veto a new resolution. It puts the onus of burden on the Iranians, on the Chinese, on the Russians, on other countries that would be looking to help the Iranians out in those situations. And then the last thing is the issue of duration. The problem we have right now is that we've got, on the one hand, an Iranian president who I think actually wants this deal, and I think would comply with it, because he's got good strategic reasons for wanting to do that. The problem is that there are other elements of his government who I don't think share that perspective, who have a very different perspective on what's in Iran's best interests. And I don't know what comes after this president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani. We always have to remember that we had a president in Iran, Mohammad Khatami, who was fantastic, said everything that we wanted him to say, tried to do everything that we wanted him to do, and of course he was succeeded by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So we can't just assume that the Hassan Rouhanis of Iran are going to continue in power forever. And in my mind, that argues for a deal of a longer duration that's going to give us confidence. The last point I'll make there is that the one big concern that I have is what I hear, what I feel from this administration, when I talk to them down in Washington, is they don't seem to be terribly fixed on those issues. They don't seem to be terribly focused on them. Instead, they seem to be very focused on these much narrower technical issues of how many centrifuges the Iranians would have and what kinds of uranium they would be allowed to have. And again, my reading of the arms control agreements is that's not what makes them work. And I'm very concerned that if we put all of our leverage against those issues, we will not get the best agreement that we could get.
Okay, but in your three criteria, substance isn't mentioned. So do you think we need to eliminate the, are you essentially prepared to leave them substantively with a breakout capability if your three conditions are met?
Yeah. I don't think we have a choice. I think that the bottom line is, and I think that the administration has accepted this, and the French have accepted it, and the British, and I think everyone else out there has accepted it, with the exception of a small part of Israel that just happens to be running the country, that recognizes that the Iranians are going to be allowed some kind of an enrichment capacity. And that will inevitably give them a theoretical breakout capability.
If we don't get a deal, is it possible that the Iranians would go up to the edge, say to a Japanese situation, and then stop themselves to avoid provoking a major crisis?
Yeah, I think it is possible. Again, something I talk about a lot in the book. And again, if we don't get the deal, I think that's got to be our fallback position, which is I think we will wind up containing Iran. In the book, I make the case for why, at the end of the day, while I don't like either of these alternatives, I think that containment is the better option than war. But I think as part of that, we've got to make an effort to prevent the Iranians from crossing the nuclear threshold. And I think that there's good reason to think that we can do that. I mean, it's worth keeping in mind, again, that the Iranians, while they've had a nuclear program for decades, actually have slowed it down in the last 10 years or so. And in particular, again, they've had the capacity to exercise this breakout option and build nuclear weapons since 2008, and they haven't done so. And there are a lot of explanations for this. In the book, I cite, I think, the four most important. One is, I think it's at different points, the Iranians were afraid that we would hit them militarily. I think that's much less of a consideration for them today, but at some point that was part of it. But I think right now what really does matter to them are things like, I think that they're very concerned that if they did that, we would then launch an all-out regime change campaign. And I think that they're very nervous. They don't like what they see already. They already think that we're trying to overthrow their government. And I think that they're very frightened that we would ratchet it up much, much further. In addition, I think that they're very concerned about our cyber capacities and that we would hit them much harder there. And last, I think that they are very frightened of what the Chinese would do. The Chinese are in a very interesting position on Iran, where on the one hand, they'd like to trade with Iran, they'd like to buy Iranian oil, but they don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. They recognize that that is a destabilizing element in the region, which affects the price of oil, which affects their economy. And the Chinese have consistently made it very clear to the Iranians that they need to go along with the deal. And when the Iranians haven't, the Chinese have come over to our side. And I think that the Iranians are very frightened of what the Chinese would do under those circumstances.
Three quick questions on Iran before moving on. One, what is your argument against the Ken Walsh position? Why are you so afraid of Iran getting the bomb?
Because I don't know how they would act. And I think Ken Walsh is a political scientist who had argued for many, many years that states behave very reasonably and, in fact, very peacefully once they acquire nuclear weapons. And again, in the book, I kind of looked at that very hard, and I looked at the history of other nuclear powers. And the argument that I came up with is that actually I don't think that powers became any more passive or aggressive. They behaved the same way after they got a nuclear weapon as they did before it, with one important exception, which is Pakistan, which did become much more aggressive after it acquired a nuclear weapon. In the case of Iran, my guess is Iran is not going to become more passive, more peaceful after acquiring a nuclear weapon, and I fear that they may become more aggressive. So that's why I'd prefer that Iran not acquire a nuclear weapon. Again, I think that containment even of a nuclear Iran, certainly I would prefer it to going to war, but it's not my best outcome. It's still running some very significant risks and paying some very significant costs.
Second of the three questions on Iran. You've been treating this as a bilateral U.S.-Iranian issue. You haven't mentioned the Israelis. Are the Israelis a third actor, wild card in this?
Yes, but much less so than I think people recognize. The Israelis have a big stake in this, so do the Gulf Arabs. And we never talk about the Gulf Arabs because, of course, the Gulf Arabs don't like to talk out loud. But behind the scenes, they are very active in this. The issue for the Israelis is that they really don't have a military option, okay? And they know it.
So it's all bluster?
Bluster is a little bit farther than I'd go. They could strike if they chose to, but what the Israelis recognize is they actually don't have much of a capacity to set this program back in a meaningful way. And I think that the best way to make that point is, it's worth keeping in mind, the Israelis don't have the same perspective on the use of force that we do. Right? The Israelis do not believe that you exhaust all other options. They don't make force the last resort. They don't put every effort into diplomacy before moving toward force. If they have a military option, they take it, and they don't talk about it. Right? My guess is that no one in this room had ever heard of the Osirak reactor before the Israelis blew it up in 1981. My guess is no one in this room had ever heard of the Syrian reactor at Al-Kabar until the Israelis blew it up in 2007.
So the fact that they're talking and not acting is a sign that they don't actually have the capacity to act?
Yes.
Interesting.
Actually, more importantly, if they had that capacity, they would have exercised it 12 years ago, which is really the moment to have done so.
Interesting. Last question. The most surprising thing you've said, as far as I'm concerned, is that you were in D.C. and had interesting and productive conversations with congressmen. I find that shocking. I thought that sanctions debate was one of the most idiotic things I've heard in a long time, even in D.C. Tell me more. You actually think that, not inside the administration, but in Congress, there's actually an appetite for legitimate, serious discussion of things like Iran policy?
I will put it this way. I think they are trying very hard. I think that there are some very bright congressmen out there, and there are others who at the very least understand that this is an important issue, and an issue on which they can't afford to simply grandstand, which is real progress.
I find that. I'm not convinced.
Gideon, I can be just as cynical or more so about the Congress than you, but I actually had some interesting conversations with them on this topic. And again, I think that they're trying hard, because I think that they get that this is a very important issue. And I think that...
Unlike, say, shutting down the government?
Oh, no, for them, that's all politics. But on this one, people may die, and they get that.
Really? You actually think they look at it that way rather than as a political football?
No, and where the administration came out ahead, and I'm not wild about how the administration handled it, but I think that they were making the right argument to the Congress, was to say, look, if you try to sabotage these talks, whatever happens with Iran is on you. And what will likely happen with Iran is one of two things. Either Iran will get a nuclear weapon, or we will go to war with Iran. And you will have to explain that to the American people. And I think that that really caught the Congress's attention. Those were the conversations that I was having with them.
Interesting. Let's go counterclockwise. Iraq. Okay. The administration seems to have bet that it could walk away without leaving troops behind, and that either Iraq wouldn't go down the tubes, or that if it did, it wouldn't come back to bite us anytime in the near future. We were discussing this earlier. Do you think, A, do you think that's a fair characterization of the Obama administration's views? And B, do you think they feel they've won that bet so far?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair characterization of their views, and I think that they're very frightened of what's going on in Iraq. I spent 2 weeks in Iraq last month before the Iraqi elections in Iraq, both in Kurdistan and Baghdad. And when I came back, I was stunned at the amount of interest from the Obama administration in every conversation that I had had with them and what was going on there. They are very concerned about the state of Iraq because you've got a situation where Al-Qaeda and its affiliates are in control of a pretty big segment of the country. They are making very big inroads into the Sunni community, and unfortunately the Prime Minister is driving things in a direction that's making that conflict worse, not better. And there's real fear on the part of the administration that this could reignite the Iraqi civil war. And unfortunately, I think that they are right to be afraid of that, and I am very concerned that we simply do not have the influence anymore to prevent that happening.
So is there anything that actually we can do?
Yeah, there are a few things that we can do.
Will they have any impact?
They might, and the most interesting thing that we could do would actually be to reach out to the Iranians. I know that we tend to see the Middle East in this kind of a zero-sum game, right? We're on one side of the chessboard, the Iranians are on another. Setting aside whether that's the right analogy at all, on the question of Iraq and its stability, this is one of these issues where we and the Iranians have pretty much the same interests. Now, at some level, obviously, the Iranians would like a government friendly to them, we'd like a government friendly to us. But both of us recognize that civil war in Iraq would be dangerous, if not catastrophic, for each of us, each for different reasons. Us because of the oil, Iran because of the incredibly close ties between Iraqi and Iranian society. And so one of the most interesting things is that in the last 2-3 years since we've really disengaged from Iraq, it's been the Iranians that have been the greatest restraining influence on the Iraqi political scene, in particular with the prime minister. And by the way, it's worth noting, we all tend to talk about the Iraqi prime minister, Nouri al-Maliki, as if he's an Iranian puppet. He is not. He hates the Iranians. And honestly, they hate him too. But they can't find ways past. I'm sure his mother does. And there are a lot of other people who have done well by Maliki. And it's also worth pointing out that there are a lot of Shia who did vote for him in this election because Maliki is the guy standing up and saying, we got to stick it to these Sunni bastards, to these Sunni terrorists. And there's nobody else on the Shia side who's saying that. That's actually made him very popular again. It's why he will come out as the leading voice after the election. They held the election. We still don't know the votes yet. The opposition claims Maliki won 72 seats out of 325 in their parliament. He claims he won 102 seats. What the Independent Judiciary Committee says, we have no idea, but we're all waiting with bated breath.
In the woulda, shoulda, coulda category, the Obama administration says, look, we asked them to leave some troops there. They didn't want any troops. They told us to go away. What would you have us do? We tried. We couldn't get it. Realistically, you're the czar of Iraq policy in 2010. Could you have done anything that would have helped stabilize Iraq after the formal end of the U.S. presence?
Sure. I mean, you're right. This is in the water under the bridge category. I mean, we can't build a time machine and
But the criticism of the Obama administration is not that things have gotten bad. It's that they could have done something that would have prevented things from getting as bad. So what is that?
I think the evidence is pretty clear that what killed that negotiation with the Iraqis was the White House unilaterally scaling back the numbers of troops. Our field commanders said we should keep 20 to 25,000 troops in Iraq, which I think was about the right number. By the way, casualties at that point were almost non-existent, so I don't think that the public would have had any problem with it had the administration wanted to do so. DOD then came in and said that's too high, cut it back to 15 or 20,000. The problem was then the White House came in and unilaterally said, no, 3,000 tops, maybe less. And the problem at that point was that all of the Iraqis who were lined up to support the American troop presence at that moment said 3,000 is not a serious force. 3,000 is not going to restrain anyone from doing anything. I am not going to go and stick my neck out politically for 3,000 troops. And that's what unraveled it.
Got it. Continuing counterclockwise, Syria. You actually think, unlike many of us, that there is a middle option between staying out and watching it burn and entering in some quixotic, heavy-handed way to try and stop things. What is the middle ground that you think exists?
Sure. And I'll give a thumbnail on this. And let me start by saying that I think Syria is really hard. And I think there's a very good argument for not going in. Some of you may have seen I did a piece in Newsweek last year and it was called...
not everybody spends their entire day with a Google feed of Ken Pollack articles.
Really?
Your parents do.
News to me. I was going to say, I think half this audience actually does, to tell you the truth. Anyway, for those of you who still read Newsweek, you may have seen it. And the title of the piece was, Go Big or Go Home. Because that's my feeling about Syria. Is I think that the mistake that we've been making about Syria is thinking that these half-hearted, halfway gestures are going to have some impact. They're not.
Yeah, but go big is not as big as some people would.
Right, it's not Iraq.
What do you mean by the go big?
What I mean by go big is, in effect, what we did in Bosnia. In Bosnia, everybody forgets this. Everybody wants what we did in Bosnia. Everybody talks about the Dayton Accords. And the Dayton Accords were terrific, right? They did end the Bosnian Civil War. They brought peace to the Balkans, ended things, wonderful. Dick Holbrooke has a great time out at Dayton. Everybody loves it. What everyone forgets is that what brought about the Dayton Accords was our efforts to build a Croatian military that beat the Serbs in the field. Okay? It wasn't Dick Holbrooke's diplomatic skills, formidable though those were. It also wasn't the NATO airstrikes. It was the building of a Croatian army that was running the table on the Serbs.
Plus the success of the ethnic cleansing that essentially created relatively stable populations, no?
No. For those who are interested, the CIA has published, an unclassified version, a massive history of the Balkan War, and their conclusions are very clear and they are really definitive.
It is the Croatians.
So
it's not the population disintermingling.
No, there's still a lot more that was being fought over. And it was entirely Milosevic first, and then Karadzic later, and eventually Mladic, coming to the conclusion that if we keep fighting, the Croatians are going to run us out of Bosnia altogether. And that's what brings them to the negotiating table. And of course, it then becomes critical that because we are the Croats' backers, that we can then rein in the Croats.
So we need to do that in Syria.
Exactly. It's about building a Syrian military that could actually defeat both the jihadists and the regime, but not ethnically cleanse the country.
These mythical liberal Syrian
No, it's not. Let's see. You cut that out. Cut that nonsense out, Gideon. It's not about mythical liberals. I'm not recruiting a bunch of Syrian James Madisons.
The Ahmed Shalbis of Syria.
No, it's average Syrians. It actually is. In that case, it's also very similar to what we did in Iraq. And as I point out to people, in 2006, the Iraqi security forces were a disaster. They were overrun by jihadists. They were completely infiltrated by militias. They were completely corrupt. They were utterly useless. And in about 2 years, we had completely turned them around.
But you were there on the ground with a ton of people to train them.
Right.
Didn't you have to be there to do that in Syria?
Sure, but it's not the troops who have to do it. It's about advisors. Right? It wasn't all about troops in Iraq.
So how many advisors are you talking about sending in your option?
Yeah, probably several thousand. And it grows over the course of time. But it's not about boots on the ground. It's about building a new Syrian military, one that's serious. I mean, look, think about it right now. This training course that we've got in Jordan, where we train Syrians to go and fight in the civil war, it's a month, right? We bring the guys in, and for a month, we show them which end of the rifle to point at the enemy, right? A month, you don't teach anyone anything. What you need is a program that lasts about a year, where you actually build real units, where you take people out of their militias, where you actually get to find out who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and who are the guys who are just doing it because they got nothing else to do. And you create a conventional military. This is something we've done in lots of places in the world. Iraq is just the best example because Iraq was such a disaster in 2006, exactly the way that Syria and the Free Syrian Army is today.
You do all this, you do everything you want. What % chance do you have of stabilizing the situation or pushing back?
I'm not going to give you a number, right? This is the first thing that we learned at the CIA. I'll put it this way. Historically, there's every reason to believe that this can work.
Over what time frame?
2 to 4 years. That's historically about how long this takes.
And we should do this, we should make this investment.
Now you're putting words in my mouth again. What I'm saying is, if we want to intervene, this is the way to do it. And if we're going to have a debate over whether or not to intervene, this is the option we should be looking at, not all these silly, nonsensical options that we're thinking about.
The two options on the table are this policy and that you just sketched out, and current policy. Which do you choose?
If those are my only two options, I'd go for my policy, because my policy actually has the prospect of creating a Syria that's stable and peaceful, and not creating spillover into the region and threatening all of our allies and creating a home for terrorists. The current option is doing all of those things.
That's true.
Now, if you said to me the alternative is a real containment policy, my answer to that is, again, having looked at it historically, it's hard to do, but that strikes me as a more reasonable alternative. What I don't like about what we're doing now is it is Vietnam. It is creeping escalation. We keep putting in a little bit more and a little bit more, never enough to have any meaningful impact, but constantly committing ourselves more and more to what's going on and making the fight worse and worse, making the bloodshed worse, and making the spillover onto our allies worse.
Oh, come on. What year in Vietnam? You're talking about 61?
I'm sorry?
In Vietnam? I mean, you said this is Vietnam.
This is 61 to 65 to 66.
We aren't,
You want to have a historical debate, we can have that later. Nobody cares about that.
Continuing our circle, Middle East peace process, we can deal with this one quickly. Nobody has any significant, nobody was surprised by what happened. Two questions. One, if nobody was surprised by what happened, why the hell did they waste so much time, effort, and trouble doing it, trying to do it? And two, what happens now?
First, I think it was good that we tried. And I give Secretary Kerry
I agree, actually.
a lot of credit.
We're rare in that.
Yeah.
We're unusual.
I think, and this is one where we both worked for Bill Clinton at the NSC, and Bill Clinton has this wonderful phrase that I love, and I think it applies very much to the peace process. He always applies to the peace process, that this is one of these where you want to get caught trying. And that's what happened, and I think that it was good on the administration for trying, in particular, good on Secretary Kerry. Because at the very least, no one in the region can accuse us of just having sold out the Palestinians, having turned our back on the Arab-Israeli issue, of simply being slaves to the Israeli government. And that's important because we've got a lot of interests out there. And I think that Secretary Kerry was able to do that in a way that also didn't make anyone in Israel feel like he was selling them out, although, as always with Secretary Kerry, he really needs to stop talking at some point in time. And someday I'm sure that he will do that. I think the bigger question is, where does this go now? And the fear that everyone has, and I share it, is that we will have a third intifada. And what's interesting about this moment, of course, is that everyone who knows anything about the second intifada and the first intifada knows it was a disaster. And in particular, it was a disaster for the Palestinians. And the Palestinian leadership today gets that. The problem is the youth don't. And talking to a number of Israeli reporters, in particular journalists who go into the West Bank, they tell very consistently the same story, and it's very disconcerting. What they say is, if you talk to the 30 and 35 and 40-year-olds in the West Bank and Gaza, they will all say to you, the second intifada was a terrible mistake. We never should have done it. But what they will also say is, if you talk to the 18 and 20 and 25-year-olds, they don't remember it, and they want to do it all over again. And I think that's the danger that's out there.
Couldn't you make the case the first intifada actually was helpful in getting the Israelis back to the table?
You can certainly make a case that Palestinian pressure has helped to do that. I think the problem there is that I think there are much better and smarter ways for the Palestinians to have done things, and I don't simply want to leave it at that.
That's a different
It is a
case.
different, but it's a related question. As you know, I teach at Georgetown, and we do a class on the Arab-Israeli peace process, and at the end of it, my students invariably come out with the conclusion that if the Palestinians had adopted Gandhi's nonviolent approach back in 1948, they probably would have had a state by 1952. And that by adopting violence instead, they've actually made it very difficult for them to get one.
There's a piece in the next issue of Foreign Affairs about exactly that.
How about that?
Chenoweth and Stepan about nonviolent resistance. You could sum it up by being like the most interesting man in the world. Like, revolutions don't always succeed, but when they do, it's because they start nonviolently. And we could continue around the circle to Egypt and Saudi, but let's, before turning it over to the audience, give a quick summary take on your view of Obama's foreign policy.
As you know, I must say I'm not much of a fan. I can certainly point to parts of the world where I think that they have done better. But in general, I think that this disengagement from the world has come with a price. And my real fear is that that price is going to escalate over time. And I am struck, to go back to the question that you asked me about Iraq, I am struck by how for the first 4 years of the Obama administration, I had Obama administration officials constantly telling me that I was exaggerating the problems in the region, they really weren't that bad, that we were really the problem, and once we had removed ourselves from the situation, the problems would actually get better, and that this was true in general around the world, and that even if there were problems, they really wouldn't hurt us at home. And certainly the first part has been proven demonstrably false. The problems of the Middle East, I would argue of the world, have gotten worse without us, and this disengagement has not served us. So far, may not have hurt us directly in the homeland, but my concern is, when you start listening to people like the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, talking about the terrorist threat, when you start looking at the IEA reports on future energy trends and the impact on oil prices, that, we're kind of one bad step away from some very severe repercussions here at home. I think that this was the lesson that our country learned after World War II, was that we can't afford to simply walk away from the world. We are too intertwined with it. Our economy is too intertwined with the rest of the world. And while we don't have to go to the same extreme that the George W. Bush administration did and play whack-a-mole all over the place, and that the military is not the best tool for every problem that we face, and that I would also say that we ought to be doing a much better job of involving other countries, in particular the Chinese and the Indians, who increasingly have a bigger stake in the international order, getting them involved in dealing with some of these problems, that nevertheless, right now, there is no other substitute for the United States. We remain, in Madeleine Albright's phrase, the indispensable nation. And when we walk away from that, it's not just the world who pays a price, it's us.
So drones and fracking aren't a substitute for foreign policy?
I think you've put it very nicely. No.
But I'm being deadly serious. Drones and fracking, I mean, you could say that the Obama, your future downsides are always in the future. And if you're Obama, you could say, you know what, you were the gloomy Gus who was telling me that I would hit the wall earlier, and so far I've gotten away with it longer than some expected. Why can't I continue to do that?
Again, there's no way to prove a negative. But I think that if you look out there at the trends on the horizon, whether it be Putin in the Ukraine, or what's happened in Egypt, or what is happening now in Syria, or the South China Sea, none of these trend lines look particularly good. And in particular, I think the best proof of that is how much the Obama administration is having to take a different approach and get more involved in a way that they weren't in their first term. And I think that the clearest point is they don't believe what you just said.
But if they were wrong in the first place, why should we think they're right now? On that note, let's turn it over to you guys. I've had enough fun grilling him. By the way, the thing about Ken is he knows so damn much that you could literally take another couple of hours and continue going around not just the region, but the broader region. You could have it be like a giant spiral around every country, encompassing most of the globe, and he'd still give you the same thoughtful, measured, serious, informed answers that would be a sort of amazing tour d'horizon. So this is why this guy should be in government running foreign policy, not just talking about it from the outside. With that, let's throw it open to you guys. Yes, over here.
Yeah, this is a great question. Sure. The question is about Kurdish autonomy, Kurdish independence. I will put it this way. I get to see Masoud Barzani, the president of the Iraqi Kurdish region, 2 or 3 times a year. And I have no doubt in my mind that Masoud wants to be the first president of an independent Kurdistan. And I think that he believes that between where Turkey is, and the Turks have really changed their position on Kurdish independence, I think between that and the potential development of Kurdish oil fields, that it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. That said, I think that question of when is a really big one. And there was a time, I was actually, to the extent that you pay attention to it, you may know, a number of years ago, Masoud Barzani announced suddenly that he was going to hold a referendum in a month across Kurdistan on independence. I was one of the 3 Americans in the room that he made that statement to. So I've seen Masoud when he is bound and determined to have independence and have it now. And what I've seen from him recently is that this is a guy who's recognized that actually it's going to be a lot harder than that. The oil isn't coming online as fast as he hoped it would. The Americans are pushing back hard. The Iranians are pushing back hard. And as I suggested, the Iranians have even more influence than we do these days. And I think that a number of Kurds are also raising this issue of, do we really want to tie ourselves to the Turks, who right now are great on Kurdistan, but historically have been terrible on it. And the reason that they're being great on it is because of Erdogan. And they've suddenly realized that Erdogan may not be around forever, and what happens when he is gone. The issue of the Syrian Kurds further complicates it, because the more that Syria descends into deeper and deeper into civil war, the more that the Syrian Kurds move toward autonomy and link up with the Iraqi Kurds. And that creates both this greater move for wider independence, but also pressure even on the Turks. It's simply a way of saying that I don't think that we know the answer to that question yet. I think that Kurdish independence is likely to happen. It's not clear when. The bigger question is, does it happen violently or does it happen peacefully? And there, you've got to watch what happens in Iraq. Because if Iraq goes back into civil war, if, as I suggested beforehand, the moves that Prime Minister Maliki is making and the moves that the opposition are making drive the country back into civil war, I think under those circumstances, you will see the Iraqi Kurds declare independence. And the Syrians will try to join them. And then all bets are off.
Ken knows more about this than I do. That said, I would suggest that people interested in this particular subject as well, there's take a look at a piece in the new issue. Marina and David Ottaway have a piece. Did you take a look at it? I don't know if you it's basically about how the Kurdish arrangement with Turkey is an example of how the Sykes-Picot arrangements can be subtly undermined by economic cooperation in a nonviolent way. And so when people talk about the decline of the Sykes-Picot order in the Middle East, and they think about it in terms of independence and in terms of violent separation or redrawing of borders, but actually what you may be seeing in Kurdistan is a kind of new hybrid arrangement in which you get cross-national cooperation that subtly redetermines and redefines sovereignty in ways that are not as abrupt and simple as independence or breakup and so forth. So anyway, it's an interesting case. Yes, over here.
If the unthinkable should happen, is there a problem with proliferation?
Yeah, this is it's an issue I deal with head-on in the book. The question is, what if the unthinkable should happen and the Iranians acquire nuclear weapons? Is there a problem with proliferation? Yes, there is a problem with proliferation. The problem is called Saudi Arabia, and that's where we need to focus it on. It's, people have talked about the possibility of the United Arab Emirates or Egypt or Turkey. Again, I deal with them in the book. I think them all highly unlikely to get nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia, I think, is a very real issue. Like many other former...
the PACs?
Well, this is the issue, is nobody quite knows how they would do it, and that's hard.
The Saudis can't do it in their own nuclear program.
Well, it depends on how many German and French scientists they recruit.
So but they buy it from the PACs, right?
Well, this is the issue. I mean, when I was at CIA, we used to have this great expression that somewhere in the basement of Kahuta, the Pakistani nuclear plant, there is a nuclear weapon, and stenciled on the side of it is property of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Because it was the Saudis who paid for the Pakistani nuclear program, and nobody believes that they did it out of the goodness of their heart.
So it's the bomb in the Pakistani basement.
Exactly, right. Somebody else's basement.
Got it.
That said, the Saudis paid for that program back in the 1980s. They bought their first nuclear-capable missiles in the 1980s, and at the time we were terrified that they were going to get nuclear warheads for those missiles, and they didn't. And they didn't because they actually have very good reasons not to get a nuclear weapon. And it's a way of saying that, again, I think you're absolutely right. The issue of proliferation is one of the problems that we would face with nuclear Iran. That's one of the reasons, Gideon, why I would prefer not to go down the road blithely of containment. I think containment is feasible, but it's not a sure thing, and it does come with costs and risks. This is one of them. That said, again, I also don't think it slam dunk. In fact, as I talk about in the book, I think that the most likely case is the Israelis' favorite scenario for what happens with Saudi Arabia the day after Iran gets a nuclear weapon. And their scenario, I love this, and I love it because I think it's right. Their scenario is that the day after Iran detonates its first nuclear weapon, a flight of Pakistani F-16s shows up at a remote Saudi airbase. And we see it on our satellite imagery, and the Israelis see it, and the Chinese see it, and the Russians see it, and we all go to the Saudis and say to them, there are Pakistani F-16s at your airbase. What are they doing there? And the Saudis are going to say, We have Pakistanis all the time, which is true. There was a period of time when they had an entire brigade in their army that was nothing but Pakistanis. And they have lots of Pakistani pilots flying their planes, so this actually isn't anything new. And we would say to them, do those F-16s have nuclear weapons with them? And the Saudis will probably say, oh, we would never have Pakistani nuclear weapons in our country. And we'd say to them, could we inspect the airbase to be sure of that? And the Saudis would say, oh, no, absolutely not. You can't. And under those circumstances, we wouldn't be able to sanction them. We wouldn't be able to take any action against them because we wouldn't know if they had nuclear weapons. But the Iranians would have to make the calculation that they now had Pakistani nuclear weapons. It's a clever way of getting around that problem. Pardon?
Vaporware.
Yeah, kinda, sorta. Opaque proliferation.
Interesting. Yes, over there.
I don't know whether I remember correctly, but at the time the nation was debating the invasion of Iraq, when Hussein was still in power, I believe that you wrote an article somewhat in support of it, which some found surprising. One, do I remember correctly? And two, do you regret that now?
More than an article. He wrote an article for me for Foreign Affairs. Then he wrote a book based on the article.
Right. And you're right, I actually like the way that you characterized it, because I argued in favor of a war with Iraq. Unfortunately, I didn't argue in favor of the war that we got. Do I regret it? Yes, I do. What I regret about it was not having said, more loudly, more forcefully, that how we do it is as important as what we do. And again, for those who actually read the book, they will remember I had an entire chapter at the end that said the most important part of a war is the reconstruction. If we're not prepared to do the reconstruction correctly, we shouldn't invade at all, because if we don't do the reconstruction correctly, we will get, this is a literal quotation, chaos, civil war, and warlordism, and we will create as many problems as we solve. And again, when I went on Oprah, I made these points, but I wish I had said them even more loudly. And I said, we don't have to go to war now. In fact, we should wait. We don't need to rush to war. It doesn't make sense to. We need a bigger coalition. We need to let the UN process play out. And unfortunately, all anyone ever remembered was the subtitle of my book, which was The Case for Invading Iraq. And some of my favorite reviews were the people who said, this book doesn't say at all what people think it says.
So why don't I just say two more things about that, because it's actually a very important kind of thing. The first of all is everything he just said is absolutely right. As his editor at the time and former co-author on a piece that was the best case for containing Iraq against some of the stupider strategies for invading, which he then defected from our consensus and went over to the other side and was so intelligent and convincing that we brought a bunch of the rest of us along. I would say two things. One is, everything he just said is true about the circumstances under which he said we should do it and how they ignored him. And it's totally unfair that Ken gets blamed for the Bush administration's war. It's legitimate to blame you for a war in Iraq, but not for that war in Iraq. Two other things, though. One is, Ken is probably the only person that I can think of in the field who actually has been honest about his writings and positions and has defended what he felt he got right and what he felt he got wrong in print continuously. The notable thing
and apologized
about the vast majority of people who in the field is that nobody ever acknowledges they're wrong, and everybody is wrong in many cases, and Ken has the guts to actually own up to it. And so also the last thing is, you heard a lot of people talk about the surge as if it were some policy that were discovered in 2006 by the geniuses in the Bush administration. What the surge actually was, to the extent that people think it actually stabilized Iraq, which it did, at least for a time, the surge was the policy that Ken Pollack advocated what we should have been doing in 2003 on. So the Bush administration really should get credit for backing off its idiotic strategies from 2002 through 2006 and adopting the approach that the people who wanted a more aggressive Iraq policy were suggesting all along in 2003. So that's what I say about that. We'll take one more question. Yes, over here. Okay, a double question.
Do you believe Israel has an electromagnetic pulse weapon that could send Iran back to the Stone Age in terms of their modern infrastructure
Yeah, great questions. On the first question of an Israeli electromagnetic pulse weapon, I don't know, and more importantly, I don't think the Israelis know. Right? So I'm sure that the Israelis have been experimenting with electromagnetic pulse weapons. The problem is, until you actually test one, you have no idea what it's going to do. Right? Electromagnetic pulse, we know it exists. We know it is a physical phenomenon. And people have studied the effect of EMP from a conventional nuclear warhead. Right? No one has ever seen the Israelis test an EMP weapon. Right? And until you test it, you don't want to use it. And in particular, you don't want the test to be the use. Right? You don't want to launch it against Iran and find out it doesn't work. That's the worst of all possible worlds. Second, what are the Iranians thinking? What might they do with a nuclear weapon? Do they actually want to destroy the state of Israel? Something I talk about at great length in the book. I will put it this way. I think that there certainly are some Iranians who would love to obliterate the state of Israel, right? Just as I would really like Warren Buffett to turn his entire fortune over to me, right? I think it has about as much chance of happening. And I think that those Iranians understand that the likelihood of that happening is about as likely as Warren Buffett signing over his fortune to me, right? So it's something that they may want in some kind of, bizarre theoretical sense. But more important than that, we've not seen any Iranian ever try to actually make this happen. And what we've typically found of the Iranians is that, and look, I don't want to soft pedal you. I don't want to make you think that the Iranians are somehow, that the Iranian regime are nice people. They're not. The Iranian regime is murderous. It is anti-American. It is anti-status quo. It is undoubtedly anti-Semitic. They are a nasty group of people. They're also very realistic. They're not messianic. They're not crazy. They are not irrational. And what we've consistently seen from them, and again, I deal with it at length in the book because it is such an important topic, is they have tremendous respect for American power and for Israeli power. And every time they cross one of our red lines, what they try to do is they try to come right up to the red line, figure out where it is, and come right up to it but not go across. But there have been a couple of occasions, and I talk about those instances at length, where they have accidentally crossed a red line and only figured it out afterwards. What you see from them is they pull back immediately and really fast because they understand how much weaker they are, certainly than we are, but also the Israelis. And they have no interest in provoking either us or the Israelis. And the last point I'll make on that is, you did have Ahmadinejad make this ridiculous statement about wiping Israel off of the map. And, you get these Iran scholars who debate what exactly he said. What matters is, of course, that the Iranians came back and said, no, that's really what he said, right? And they put up banners all over Tehran saying we should wipe Israel off. The hardliners in Tehran put up these banners in Tehran saying that we should do it. A week after Ahmadinejad made that statement, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, made a statement saying, we are not seeking the destruction of any state, okay? All we seek is to live in peace. We will fight any country that attacks us, but we are not going to conduct an aggressive war against anyone. And I got to tell you, you could almost feel the body language in that statement. The Ayatollah did not want to make that statement. It was painful for him to make that statement. But he wanted us and the Israelis to understand that Ahmadinejad did not speak for the Iranian regime.
Ken said earlier that one policy, either containment of Iran or something on Syria, sucked. It was a technical way of putting it. When I teach foreign policy, I sometimes start my students off with what I call Rose's first law of foreign policy, which is that all policies suck, but some suck more than others. And the real choice among professionals is, okay, not what is your ideal policy, but given the pathetically bad options realistically available, given one's trade-offs, one's risk calculus, one's priorities, which particular bad policy is least bad for you on balance. And none of these questions that we've been talking about tonight have easy or good answers. What you just heard is a serious professional walking you through the kinds of choices that we have and giving you a serious professional's honest array of probabilities, possibilities, and choices. I think that the way to analyze this, and it's not the way that it's usually done, What you're looking at is Albert Pujols. What you're looking at is Derek Jeter. When Albert Pujols or Derek Jeter goes to the plate, they don't get a home run every time. They don't get a hit every time. They strike out a hell of a lot. So does our CIA. So do all of us dealing with these kind of things. But that doesn't mean they're not at the top of their game, and that doesn't mean that they're not a hell of a lot more worth having at bat than the journeyman on their team. And I can't think of anybody I would rather have, and I say this as the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine and a multi-decade veteran in the field, I can't think of anybody I'd rather have advising me on Middle East policy were someone to make me czar, which is about as likely as Buffett giving you his fortune, than Ken Pollack, even though I might sometimes have the temerity to occasionally disagree with one or another of his policy recommendations. I think we are all very lucky to have had the opportunity to chat with him tonight. You should all go buy his book and get him to sign it for you later. Thank you.